you wrote a piece recently in C2C Journal, and it was basically on parental pushback, and the fight against critical race theory coming in with the Ontario School Board. And that Ontario School Board has already had a few flare-ups with some kind of unusual occurrences, I guess you could say. They're quite something. But in the sense of critical race theory, I mean, a lot of people think that's just an American phenomenon, but obviously it's an issue up here as well.
Yeah, it is. And what people don't often realize is they don't tend to use the words critical race theory. I mean, they've cottoned on to the fact that people don't like it, that the United States certainly had a backlash among parents. And so here in Canada, educators who are in favor of things like critical race theory don't call it that at all. They'll call it things like anti-racism education. And part of that will also be white privilege instruction. So parents have probably heard about that, that their kids are being taught about white privilege, or that their kids are being exposed to anti-racism education. But what they need to know is that the foundation of that really is critical race theory, and it's just the practical applications of it. In terms of anti-racism education, for example, we've got these books out there, How to Be Anti-Racist. One was written by a fellow, he's at Boston University, his name's Ibram Kendi. And it essentially says that discrimination based on skin color is a good thing. He will say that if it is anti-racist discrimination and it's taking on past wrongs, past historical wrongs, then that's a good thing. So essentially, with anti-racism education, we're actually seeing students being told discrimination can be a good thing.
Yeah, it's kind of gone a bizarro full circle. I mean, I've seen that we're just adding to division. I mean, I think the goal for initially, when there was problems with true systemic racism and institutionalized racism, was that race just wouldn't be a matter anymore. We'll get to a point where it's irrelevant. We are treating each other as equal. And now we're kind of dividing each other on the basis of anti-racism. It's counterintuitive, but that's where this sort of theory starts to come about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, where it is most insidious is this teaching of white privilege, which is seen across all the boards in Ontario and certainly all across the West and everywhere in Canada, everywhere in the US. And this idea of white privilege, just in case people aren't familiar with it, it essentially teaches that if you're white, many of the successes, or maybe even the majority of your successes, are due to your white skin. Now, conversely, it's equally damaging to students of color because it teaches that no matter how hard they work, the deck is stacked against them and they can't succeed. So in that, we have this subtle racism of low expectations. And the thing that I pointed out in the article that you mentioned in the C2C Journal is that the research surrounding things like diversity education, anti-racism education, and in particular, white privilege, the research actually shows that it doesn't do what it intends to do. In fact, it does harm.
Well, yeah, I mean, if somebody feels, kids are at a developmental stage at that point. They're very impressionable. If you're being taught at a young age that you're at a disadvantage, I mean, I guess for some it would inspire people to rise above and push past that. But for others, it might give a sense of defeatism and actually, it'd be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's not good for anybody.
No. And you know what? You should have been a social scientist yourself, because what you're talking about is a really well-studied phenomenon called stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat says exactly what you're saying, and we've got a lot of studies surrounding it. It's essentially that if you keep telling students of color or people of color that the deck is stacked against them, then they'll begin to believe it, and then they will underperform. The interesting thing is, when you have people of color who are immigrants to Canada, for example, and they don't buy into that particular false notion that the deck is stacked against them, they actually overperform. The latest Statistics Canada data showed that people of color actually have a greater chance of getting a university degree than white populations that have been here for decades or hundreds of years. So we're seeing that now. And really, it's a testament to this idea that the harder you work and also your home life, if you have two parents that are together and in a solid relationship, those are the things that matter.
Yeah, there's other social factors beyond that, and some of that does put light to it. I mean, we've seen a great success in Asian and South Asian populations, for example, and immigrants in most measures, whether it's educational or financial and such. But those factors, when you dig into it, tend to be it's a strong, supportive family unit. It's a culture very much of ambition and moving ahead, and you know those are beyond. I mean, if it was just purely racial disadvantages, they wouldn't be able to excel as well as they have.
Well, that's really true. And let me just give you an example from my own area. So I'm in Waterloo Region, and the Board of Education is the Waterloo Region District School Board. And we currently have a director of education who's been pushing so hard to get identity to be the key focus of the Board of Education, to the exclusion of things like basic numeracy, literacy. He's really focused on identity. And he's had some pushback on that from parents who are saying, why is this the focus? And he felt so much pressure. In fact, he had to write this op-ed in the local newspaper. And in it, he goes on to say that we need to focus on identity because, and I'm going to try and get the quote as close as possible. He says, it's no secret since the advent of public education, identity has been a predictor of outcome. Well, I looked at that and I knew it was just completely at odds with the research because it's simply not so. In terms of identity, it's one of the worst predictors, the most unreliable predictors of academic outcome. So I quickly shot out a letter to the editor. And among other things, I noted that in the UK, they'd just done the largest study of the effect of race on academic outcome. The UK Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities put this out. I think it was March or May 2021. Anyway, they went on to say that the evidence shows conclusively family influence, socioeconomic background, culture, and religion have the most significant impact on things like academic achievement. And it was specific, they noticed this specifically, they say, but racism was one of the least important factors in all of this. So anyway, I shot this out, but you'd think that research would have an effect on the leaders in our educational community, but I think that they're blinded by ideology.
Yeah, and again, we just get the most worried. I think perhaps that's where it's finally getting this pushback because now it's actually targeting young children. It's not even in the levels of our post-secondary where we've always seen kind of some woke lunacy taking hold over the years, but at least those are grown, people, students and so on who can make up their own mind. But when we start to bring these ideologies into the classrooms of kids at such a young age, and on theories that are ideologically based, as you said, I mean, it can cause a lot of damage. I feel for the white children who are in class too are almost being shamed, and called out of the group. And again, that's the opposite of what we should have ever done. I mean, there was shaming and abuse against minority children in the past, and it was terrible. But turning it around and doing it now with children who aren't people of color isn't helping the situation whatsoever.
Yeah, and it cuts both ways. I mean, the students of color are also being told you're not good enough, right? I mean, it's racism both ways. And you're absolutely right to say that the effect on young people is significant. Again, I came before my school board and I presented them with the research. And this research is detailed in the piece that I wrote in C2C Journal as well. So if your audience wants to take a look, they can go there. But let me just point out a few things. So there was a 2019 study that was done in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General. That was the name of it. And the lead researcher was from Colgate University. Anyway, he wanted to look at what effect would teaching white privilege have on the attitudes of students. And well, they found out that it did absolutely nothing to make people more sympathetic to poor Black or people of color. Didn't do anything good. But what the researchers did find, and I'm going to read the quote I have up here. I left it on my screen. The researchers concluded learning about white privilege reduces sympathy, increases blame, and decreases external attributions for white people struggling with poverty. So in short, what they found was that teaching about white privilege doesn't do any good, but it does do harm, and it actually makes students more hostile toward poor whites.
Yeah, and the division doesn't serve anybody. The later part of your article, though, does cover, I mean, the growing resistance to this kind of ideology. I mean, this hasn't gone unopposed in Ontario or in the United States, for that matter. Are parents finally standing back? I mean, standing up. I mean, one of the problems we've had is a lot of apathy when it comes to electing school boards. People don't pay attention. Most people can't even name their local school trustee. You think there's going to be maybe more participation, people paying attention now that things are kind of getting a little off the rails?
I know there will be. I know there will be. For example, I was concerned. I've got a daughter still in high school here in the Waterloo region, and I hear what she's being told in class, and I know that it is empirically incorrect, the things that she's being taught by these so-called anti-racism educators. So I took it upon myself to start a local chapter of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Now, even though that sounds kind of on the left, it's actually dedicated to preserving the ideas put forward by Martin Luther King Jr. that we should judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. It's really about being pro-human. Anyway, I started this chapter of Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, or FAIR, and I've had hundreds of parents show interest. I've got a solid, just under 100 who are solid members, and then we'll get more and more interest from just supporters. And I'm not the only group. There's Action for Canada. There's Parents as First Educators. And each of these groups is searching for trustees, people who would be candidates for trustees, to bring back sanity to our boards. And the response has been overwhelming. And not just in Waterloo region, but across Ontario. And I'm not sure what's happening in municipal or trustee elections across Canada, but I can only assume that parents, for the good of their children, are finally waking up and they're taking action.
Well, that's it. And I mean, I kind of like the naming, whether it's left, right, it doesn't matter. I mean, a Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, because that's what the ideologues will always throw back. If you question it, you're immediately labeled as a racist. Well, a racist. I mean, if you oppose our anti-racist view, it means you thus must be pro-racist. Well, no, and it's a lazy way to frame a debate or a way to shut one down. And, we need to have rational discussion on this.
We do. And I think that they've overplayed their hand. And now parents who typically have a lot more common sense than the people who have been indoctrinated through education programs, they're seeing what is actually going on. And they're saying your definitions simply do not make sense, because in our hearts, we all know that discrimination based on skin color is a terrible thing. And we almost got rid of it. We were so close. And then suddenly we have these woke activists who are coming back and saying, no, you know what? Actually, let's bring back discrimination based on skin color. Well, this is just playing with fire. And again, I'm all about the data. I want to know what actually will do the most good in our society to bring unity. And the things that they're promoting under the guise of anti-racism education or critical race theory or white privilege, it doesn't do good. It does harm.
Oh, well, that's it. Being about the data, I mean, we're seeing examples. We've seen, places where this has been brought in. I mean, hey, if we saw great successes and these graduates coming out that are unified and functional and happy and get along with each other, then great. Well, let's carry on. But there really hasn't been any evidence of that. Again, and as far as I can see, it's actually adding to division, no matter what they may say the motivations are.
Oh, for sure. And again, the data is just so ample. If these people who are running our education systems would just allow it to be presented to parents. I'll give you another example. So this is a great one. There's a professor at Princeton. Her name is Elizabeth Paluck, Paluck, and she did a 2001 study. It was published in the Annual Review of Psychology, which is one of the top psychology journals in the world. And so she does this meta-analysis of 400 existing studies. And what she wanted to see is, what good does diversity training do? Now, keep in mind that things like anti-racism education and white privilege, these are the core modules of diversity training. Whether it's done in a business or in a school, it's the same stuff. So they're trying to look at these 400 studies that have already said what's being done with diversity training. And this is what they came up with. So they, after looking at these 400 papers, they saw that the bold claims that were being made were completely false. Because in terms of this kind of instruction, the average impact, and again, I'm giving the data completely from this paper, the average impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion training is zero. The impact is zero. It doesn't change you. It doesn't help. But then you've got other people like Frank Dobbin, who's a sociologist at Harvard. He said, yep, that's true. But he did his own studies. And what he looked at was, well, it doesn't do good, but does it do harm? And he says, yeah, it does. In fact, this kind of diversity training, whether it's white privilege or anti-racism education, it has a fairly good chance, I can't remember the percentage he gave, but a fairly good chance of making people more prejudiced. So it won't do good, but it can do harm. And this is what we're promoting in our schools and in our universities.
And it's terribly unfortunate. Well, I'm glad to see efforts are, being made to call it out and hopefully bring it to account. I mean, there are democratic means to change some of these school boards, universities. That's going to be a much bigger and harder task. But at least, to keep the kids just sticking to their, I would think, a rational curriculum and trying to keep, things on the up and up there until they can grow old enough to sort some of those things out would be really important. So I appreciate you calling it out in your article and coming on to talk to us today. Where can we find more information about what you're doing and your organization?
So I would encourage people, first of all, to go to the article in C2C. And it's about CRTC. I can't remember the title, but it's Parental Pushback, I think is the subtitle. And it's in C2C Journal. And that actually has links in the actual article to the organizations, the grassroots community organizations that are pushing back against some of this stuff. So that's a place to go. Another place to go would be to the main website for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and look for the local chapter. There are now chapters across Canada, and find your local chapter and then work to support them.
Great. Well, yeah, it was in the C2C Journal, which is C and then the number 2C for folks Googling it. It was Parental Pushback, the Fight Against Critical Race Theory by David Millard Haskell. So if you search that out, you'll find, as you said, that the article has a lot of links and background as well for all the rest of that. So thank you again for coming on to talk about it today. And then let's hope we can return some productive rationality to our education system.
Yeah, let's hope. Thanks very much.